Good afternoon and welcome to today's session, Future of Work 2020, 5 Strategies to Develop and Retain Diverse Early Career Talent. Before we begin, we would like to thank our sponsor Tallo. Tallo is an online platform with one goal, to connect talent with opportunities. Over 1 million users and well over 23% of the minority students use the Tallo app to build digital profiles and figure out the next step that's right for them. Colleges and companies use Tallo to find the talent they need. Think jobs, apprenticeships, scholarships, and more. For more information, check out Tallo. And now it is my pleasure to turn over today's session to our presenter, Chelsea Williams. Chelsea, take it away.
Excellent. Actually, before we hand over to Chelsea, I would love to introduce myself. My name is Liz, and I have the pleasure of being the administrator for this session. And before we get started, I would love for everyone to take a moment to please introduce yourself in the chat by sharing your name, the name of your employer institution, and one anchoring word you would use to describe 2020 so far. My personal choice would be revolutionary, but I can't wait to see what you all come up with. So please take a moment to do that. And we'd also love for everyone to rename yourself on this call and add your preferred gender pronouns to your name so it more accurately reflects your identity. And if you don't know how to do that, you simply hover over the square with your picture or your name. And in the top right-hand corner, you should see a blue icon. Click that icon with the 3 white dots and you should get the option to rename yourself. It would be fabulous if everyone could take a moment to do that as well. Additionally, before we dive into the session, we do have a few rules of engagement we like to establish just to make sure we have the most impactful session possible. The first ask is that only Chelsea and the presenters have their audio and video on. And this is, of course, to prevent any distractions during our time together. And secondly, if you have questions throughout the presentation, you are welcome to submit your questions through the chat, as I will be monitoring the chat regularly to ensure that we address all the questions we are capable of answering in this session. You can also send me a private message if you choose to remain anonymous. And to do that, you're simply going to go to the recipient section at the bottom of the chat window and then click my name, Liz Roy, from the drop-down menu. You're also welcome to use the Q&A function, as we will be monitoring that as well. And during the Q&A section at the end of this presentation, if you would like to directly address Chelsea with your question, use the raise your hand function, and that way I will know to unmute your line so that way you can speak directly to Chelsea. Lastly, I know for some of us it's the middle of a work day on a Tuesday, so you're likely a little tired, but we absolutely thrive on your energy and participation. So we ask that you please remain engaged and use the chat to answer questions and share your thoughts and opinions so we can have a really good, productive dialogue today. Excellent. And with that, I will turn it over to our incredible presenter for this session, Chelsea Williams. You all are in fabulous hands with her, as she has so much wisdom to share over the next 90 minutes. Thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you so much, Liz, for the warm introduction. And thank you so much, NACE community, for joining this most important conversation today. Before I share a little bit about myself, I did want to thank the NACE staff for their support in putting this program together and their general partnership. So Sean, Megan, Mimi, Aaron, Kevin, I think I got everyone. Thank you so much for your support. So again, I'm Chelsea Williams, the founder and CEO of CollegeCode. I'm so excited to be spending about 90 minutes with you today to talk a little bit about best practices for engaging early career professionals who identify as diverse. This is a topic that I'm deeply passionate about, and I know many of you, a part of the NACE community, are as well. So a little bit about me. Obviously on the screen, I've highlighted a few parts of my experience, but I think I have to start by talking about my journey into early career. I am a Spelman College graduate. I was an economics major when I was at Spelman. typically when you're at a liberal arts institution and you study economics, it basically means that you go and work on Wall Street. So I was one of those people who found myself in financial services as a Spelman student. My first internship as a sophomore. Some of you in higher ed are probably aware of the Generation Next program that Barclays Capital had launched in the 2000s, in the 2009, 2010 timeframe. I was one of the sophomore interns as a part of that program. And that was literally my introduction into all things career. It's the first time that I found myself in New York City and really being exposed to early career. And so my journey of early career started off in Wall Street. I spent a second summer at Barclays before being admitted into the rotational program. So also a big fan of rotational programs and helping diverse professionals and really employees in general prepare for their next step. Okay, and so why do I share this? Because my early career background that was so rich and rewarding is what I'm so passionate about making sure other early career professionals also get to enjoy and experience. And so that's a little bit about me to get us started. I've had the pleasure of helping to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion across multi-sector, corporate, nonprofit, higher ed. Why do I share that? Because it's giving me a thought diversity to this topic of inclusion and equity. And I will bring a lot of the case studies and best practices that I've observed from those sectors into this conversation today. A little bit very quickly about CollegeCode. Our whole focus is on twofold. It's twofold, and it's really based in the future of work. So with 75% of the workforce expected to encompass millennials and Gen Z by 2025, we're supporting organizations in two ways. First, we're helping develop and retain historically underrepresented populations, both in terms of career readiness and career willingness, which I'll talk about a little bit later. That's this whole conversation on inclusive and equitable cultures that really make people feel as though they belong. And then I'm really helping organizations foster human-centered workplaces where inclusion is a forethought and not an afterthought. Okay, so that's a little bit about what we're doing at CollegeCode. Today in our time together, I have three main pillars that I'm going to highlight before we get into this main 5 winning strategies that I know all of you are interested to learn. First, I'm going to outline this whole conversation on the future of work, what it means, and what the impact is on the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. After we've talked about that, we're going to move into what are the current barriers in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because there's been a lot of investment of time and financial resources in DE&I, and some would argue, where are the results? Or some would say, are we at a point now where we can actually see systemic change? So I will highlight a few of the barriers at the early career level that I have seen exist. And then the part that you've been hoping for, you'll learn 5 winning strategies to develop and retain diverse talent. And then we'll end out with next steps and a special offer for the NACE community. So before we get started, I'd love to do a live poll. Liz is going to help to launch that. And the question is, what is your biggest challenge advancing DE&I at your organization? And I've highlighted 3 common areas I hear often, and then an other function. Always have to offer that so people feel as though they can share, additional challenges, but would love to have you on the spot reflect and then put your result directly in the poll.
Chelsea, we're already getting a ton of answers. We're going to give it another 15 seconds or so.
Perfect. Thank you, Liz.
Okay, going to end the poll now. Thank you everyone for participating.
Okay, Liz, and do you want to share the result?
Perfect.
Okay. So this is very interesting, and interesting because depending on where I'm presenting, the results pan out a little bit differently. But I would say here there's a mix across the board between leadership buy-in, people resources, and team awareness on the DE&I landscape. I'm sure if this was a check the box poll, maybe there would be an intersection of several of the responses. But this is pretty much in line with what I've heard from my partners across different sectors. It's been a mix of getting leadership on board. Yes, maybe there's an understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but maybe not the direct investment from a financial standpoint and from a people resources standpoint. Some of you put here people resources. We need people to be actually able to advance this work. And maybe that is on the lens of expertise and knowledge of DE&I, but simply just the time to give this conversation and these action steps the investment that they truly need. And then third, team awareness. And I would say that is also a very big piece that I'm hearing with some of my partners. We don't know what we don't know, or there is an opportunity for us to really commit our time to getting up to speed with some of the nuances in this space, and to make sure that we are leading DE&I through every facet of our organization. And then obviously there's the people who said other. And I always like to say, for the other piece, if you can go into the chat and share a few of the other perspectives that you have, I think that'll be fruitful for the conversation, and maybe we can talk about it at the end. Thank you so much. So before we get into the actual meat, we have to talk about what's going on. 2020, what a year it's been. And I'm saying that lightly. We'll talk about the anchoring words at some point, but it has definitely been, I would say, a banner year for conversations on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like, who knew we would be where we are? And so, I have to say with this slide, this is a non-exhaustive list. There's certainly many pillars and perspectives to DE&I, but these are just a few of the things that have been very prevalent in front of many of us, some of them from the top of the year, others in the last week or so. And so what's the point here? Diversity, equity, and inclusion is so much more multifaceted and complex than we could ever imagine. Here on the slide, I obviously have highlighted racial injustices right in front of our eyes towards the Black community, but we can also, if we look just a photo below that, see some of the anti-Asian biases that we heard throughout COVID. I am in New York City, the epicenter of where COVID hit in this country. And I can tell you, I saw live the biases that impacted many people from the Asian community, and even transparently from the Black community through COVID. And so it's important for us to understand this racial equity conversation transcends even specific races. We see here, close the coronavirus digital divide. I wanted to put up an image that challenged us to think about equity. A lot of organizations talk about diversity and inclusion, but equity is kind of like this middle ground where there is not a lot of awareness. And so when we think about the impacts of COVID, when we think about racial injustices, we can't have the best conversations, the most intentional conversations, if we don't talk about equity. And so I thought for learners and workers and people who are committing to these spaces, it's so important to think about the digital access divide that we have in this country. Who has access to technology and the resources that they need to learn and to work? That was a huge conversation that was taking place through COVID and even to this moment. Certainly, we have Supreme Court decisions for LGBTQ rights for employees, and the conversation on Dreamers. And in the middle of all of this, wellness conversations, mental health conversations, how do we maneuver through everything going on? And so what's my point? There isn't a better time that we could be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion than now. And so it really is a call to action for all of us. And so what are these terms, DE&I, people throw it around, but I didn't want to make assumptions that everyone has full understanding of these concepts. And so I wanted to take just a few minutes to highlight the three pillars of the conversation. What is diversity? It's the who and what of all the characteristics of who we are. The things we see, the things we don't see. So if you look at me as a Black woman and all you see is Black, or all you see is woman, you've missed so many parts of my identity in my experience. Similarly, if I was talking about Liz, it'd be the same conversation. And so what's the point with diversity? Diversity is more than meets the eye. And we want to make sure that we are mindful of that. I learned this concept of diversity most clearly when I was at Spelman College, historically Black women's college. So I'm thinking, oh, it's just going to be Black women or women of color. And I get there and understand, oh, there's socioeconomic diversity. There's region diversity. There's nationality diversity, and that's a short list. And so we want to think broadly when we think about diversity. Then equity, ensuring fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people. Addressing systemic barriers to the advancement of marginalized groups. So again, a lot of the times, if I'm talking particularly about employers, there has been a historic focus on diversity and inclusion, D&I. But I started seeing last year this shift to include the equity piece. And certainly this year, when we think about, these two pandemics in front of us, COVID-19 and prevailing racial injustices, again, we can't have those conversations if we don't talk about equity. And so that is a part that we want to start thinking about when we are implementing our strategy. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. And then the third piece, inclusion. It's the action piece, the verb. How do we create a safe and engaged environment for all people? And what I love to say is you can have a diverse team, a diverse organization, even a diverse neighborhood, but we don't know if it's inclusive unless we observe how people engage and interact with one another. Does everyone feel welcome? Or are there outsiders and insiders? And so inclusion becomes the responsibility of all of us to make sure our attitudes, behaviors, and mindsets really focus on curating an experience that is safe and engaging for all people, okay? And in the middle of this conversation on DE&I, we have to address this concept called intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And it is really all of the different parts of our identity. Gender, age, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, religion, spirituality, and the like. What's the point? When we're talking about developing and retaining diverse talent, we have got to take a moment to think about the intersections of all these different forms of our identity, all these different discrimination and cases that we might have, how that overlaps and intersects and how we learn and how we work. And so again, when we're talking about advancing this work, we never want to stop at face value. And so some of my best practices in the next few slides will talk about what it means to have intersectionality as a part of your DE&I strategy. My premise. So my big message that I want everyone to go here leaving with. DE&I must be a forethought, not an afterthought, or nothing will change. And as someone who's committed a lot of time to this work, I will say DE&I can no longer be a check the box. It's got to be the fabric of how we think through our strategy, how we execute on our programs, how we consider our policies, and how we embed in our organizations healthy cultures and practices where all people feel included. And so we can't have this conversation unless we think about this future of work topic. And for many of you here, I'm very aware that NACE has done quite a bit of research and conversations on the future of work. But I do think when we're talking about this conversation, we have to think about the future of work and how urgent the conversation of DE&I is in this space. And so a few things, I've been doing quite a bit of research on the future of work. I'm very intrigued by it, like I'm sure many of you are. And there's three kind of big points in the future of work space that I thought was important. A lot of times when we think about the future of work, people think technology, automation, those are like the big buzzwords. But the conversation of the future of work is actually broader than many of us consider. It's how we work, why we work, and the places and spaces in which we work. So it is broad, and there's an urgency of having the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation in this framework. So first is there's an evolution of a liquid workforce and a change in work dynamics. Liquid workforce meaning people's roles, whether it's full-time, part-time, freelance, etc., are changing and will continue to change as we progress. And so I was doing some research on freelancing and really this concept of the gig economy, and that has skyrocketed over the past few years. There's a lot, particularly from a diversity lens, of people of color, even women who are involved in the gig economy. And so when we think about this conversation of future of work, we've got to think about who is involved in that conversation and are there opportunities into the future. Second is this concept on reskilling. People gaining the skills that they need to prepare for the jobs of the future. I know many people here have heard that term before. Interestingly enough, if you do research on who will be most negatively impacted by reskilling, it is hands down women and underrepresented minorities. That is clear research. Boston Consulting Group has done a lot of studies on this. And so when we're talking about talent development, we want to make sure that we are being specific on making sure that populations such as women and underrepresented minorities understand this concept of reskilling and have the resources that they need to actually compete in the environment and the workforce of the future. And then the third is really a conversation on employee experience. And we've seen that through, I would say, COVID and this current conversation on racial injustices, that employee experience and culture matters. It matters deeply. And people are really judging where they want to work, particularly early career professionals, on what they see and what they hear about people's experiences. 72% of CEOs say the state of empathy needs to improve within organizations. That's a culture conversation. And so again, when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is often seen as a softer skill or conversation, we want to understand that's just as important as talking about sales or operations. Inclusion is no longer an option, it's a priority. And we want to make sure when we're talking about or thinking about employee experience, we understand how urgent this conversation is. So what are the barriers to advancing DE&I? We talked future of work. I told you a little bit about the foundation of these concepts. Now I want to highlight what I have seen to be barriers to advancing DE&I, particularly at the early career level. First, designing programs, policies, and practices without including target populations. And we see this happen really across industry and sector. I'm going to design something or build something. Maybe my intention is for it to reach a certain demographic, but I haven't included those people in the assessment and in the process of developing. So I've missed it. I have a blind spot potentially that doesn't allow me to curate the best experience or deliver the best service or opportunity because I haven't gotten close, proximate to the respective population. Two, not considering intersectional experiences. So I talked with you a little bit about intersectionality and what that means, and I'll talk a little bit about it in a few slides, but we have to think broadly when we're talking even about subsets and populations. Three, no buy-in from leadership, back to the survey at the beginning. And that's really important because accountability equals sustainability. If we don't have accountability from leadership in particular, it's going to be very hard for us to sustain our efforts. So how do we consider making sure that leaders are a part of advocating and really driving our DE&I goals and vision? And then the last piece, assigning mentors, managers, sponsors with no true commitment or interest in DE&I. We need to start to leverage our allies. There are allies, let's be very clear, but we need to know who those individuals are, and we need to be intentional about making sure that they're helping us meet our DE&I vision, because we truly cannot do it without the need of allies, and active allies at that. Okay, so this is really, it's a short list, but it gets you thinking about some common barriers that I have seen from my, my role and my time with employers and organizations. So the part that you're interested in now, what are the 5 winning steps to retain and develop early career talent? Now that I have been able to provide that foundation, I can go right into the list of 5. And this will be very dynamic so that you have a chance to really reflect yourself. So the first, we want to make sure we're including target populations in the design and delivery of programs, policies, and practices. What does this mean? If we are seeking to launch an initiative for first-generation college students, or programming, or a particular intern program for this demographic, have we spent the time to understand their needs, their interests, their challenges, so that we're curating an experience that actually directly connects to the problem area? Super important. And so whether that's focus groups, interviews, those informal conversations, surveys, all of that is necessary as we think about intentionality in our delivery. I see a lot of organizations invest a lot of money and time into initiatives without speaking to that end user or that target group. And oftentimes there's a miss in terms of vision and goals. And so we can take a step back to really make sure we're doing this. And so my question for you, what do you need to do to ensure your target population or populations are included in the design and delivery of programs and policies and practices? What is required of you? What action steps are going to help you get to that best outcome? My case study for this is something that we have been actively involved in at CollegeCode. We wanted to be responsive to the challenges of the class of 2020. So, we decided we wanted to curate a 3-part Jumpstart to Career virtual program for underrepresented graduates across the United States. We had overwhelming demand, had about 35 students in our first cohort for June. And we started before we even rolled out our content and brought in our speakers. We wanted to hear, what are the challenges? Okay, and that helped us to make sure we were meeting their objectives as they invested their time into these sessions. Some interesting learnings that I wanted to share with the group. 40% of our participants describe managing the job search in this current environment as their most significant challenge preparing for early career. Probably doesn't surprise us. But again, we needed to understand, amidst all the different things that could be a challenge for you in preparing for your next step, what's most difficult? And they said, job search. What do we do? How do we leverage this time? We were able to curate content and bring in speakers who can talk about how do you maximize the now. People who were challenged in the 2008 economic crisis and were able to give their perspectives of what they did during that time that helped them to set themselves up for success. Those lesson learned moments were so critical in helping our cohort. Point 2, 36% say the most important quality in a future employer is training and development opportunities. Second, DE&I commitment. Now, a lot of surveys around actually have highlighted that training and development are like the #1 quality early career professionals seek in an employer. Ripple Match has done a lot of amazing research in that space, and that's been consistent across their surveys. But we added DE&I as one of the options, and that arguably was the second most critical point for students, even to the point where in our open forum survey, they were saying, how do we assess culture to make sure it's inclusive? How do we make sure that it's actually authentic? And so this DE&I conversation we're having as practitioners is also happening amongst early career professionals. So we want to make sure we're putting it front and center. Third, 30% say mentors are the most important resource in preparing for early career. That was a shocker to me because we had on there professors, upperclassmen, career services, family members, the internet. We had a pretty big range, and arguably 30% said, yeah, it's mentors. And mentors who not only I've been assigned, but just informal relationships that have formed throughout my experience. So what's my point in showing this? Us doing this pre-survey before we launched this cohort experience helped us to make sure our content and speakers could address directly what graduates were describing as their challenge. So are we taking a moment to pause, reflect on the needs of end users, and curate our experiences from their challenges? That's essential to see success in driving DE&I. Point 2, inclusive policies, programs, and practices consider the intersectional experience. So I've already told you what intersectionality means, some of the different parts of our identity that often overlap and intersect. So I am a Black woman, and so there are 2 levels of my identity that certainly can be discriminatory, my gender and my race. If I was a Black Muslim woman, it would be my race, my gender, and my religion. And so all of these intersections we want to consider when we're talking about driving DE&I. So I would ask you, how are you considering intersectional experiences in your programs, policies, and practices? What does it look like for you? Have you considered that before? And so my example is a partner I know of NACE, the Forte Foundation, and their focus is on advancing women in business at the undergraduate and graduate level. I have been fortunate to support the Forte Foundation in several ways since last year, and I thought it was great to mention them because they're a prime example of what intersectionality in programming looks like in an authentic way. So they have their annual conferences that bring women together who are interested in business, and they realized there was an opportunity to have a particular conference for women of color at the undergraduate level. They determined within the broader group of women of color, they needed to do unique programming for Black and Latina women. Why? Because studies show Black and Latino women are most negatively impacted in the workplace, and also paid, we know from a pay gap perspective, at the bottom of the range of women's equity. And so if we're talking about advancing DE&I, we need to think about, are we using an intersectional lens to make sure our programming meets all the unique experiences within these broader subgroups. And so I would ask you in this moment, have you considered the intersectional experience before? If so, in what ways? Because that's really important in driving forth sustainable change. Point 3, ensure career services staff, university relationship team, and all interviewers and managers are culturally competent. So you want to ask yourself, are your staff and early career partners culturally competent? How do you know? And this is important, and back to the conversation we were having about active allies, that's what we need in this moment. We need people who are signing up to support the broader DEI agenda who are culturally competent, who are doing the work or willing to learn or willing to put themselves in vulnerable experiences to really get proximate to some of the challenges at hand. And so I have to share a case study that happened actually just a week ago on this topic of the importance of cultural competence. And what I'll say is it's a conversation many of you, I believe, have had. And the focus is on microaggressions. And so we were having, an organization I worked with wanted to have an affinity space to bring employees together as a response to Black injustice, particularly the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and many others in this season. And so this was open to employees across the board, functional title, region, race, ethnicity, and the like. And in the conversation, it was powerful because people started to share about their experiences in the workplace and their challenges with managers, people who they've been reporting into and they engage with every single day. And I'll never forget, as 20 of us sat on a video, one particular woman who later described herself to be a Black woman, kept her video off and shared with us the horrific experience she went through for nearly a year at the hands of her manager. She described behaviors that we would term microaggressions, cumulative, repetitive acts of marginalization and stereotyping towards a group. It was so bad, other members of the team started seeing the behavior. It was so bad that she had to actually get a therapist, as she still to this day struggles with PTSD. That manager has since left the organization, and thankfully she's still there. But it really highlighted for me and many other people there the danger of microaggressions. Because they're subtle and cumulative, sometimes we say, it's okay, it's not as bad as overt racism, we'll get over it. But are we making sure that managers, sponsors, buddies, mentors, anyone who's a part of our strategy is truly committed, particularly if we're partnering them with underrepresented groups? This is something I saw in my finance days that if I was to go back, I'd say this was a blind spot. Sometimes in just the nature of trying to get something done really quickly, we're like, I hope it works. But if we're talking about advancing DE&I, we have got to be cautious with our placements and our pairings and making sure that we're actually creating that safe space that's so necessary to meet those retention goals that we have. And so this is a powerful moment that I thought I would share because, again, I think when it comes to microaggressions, we know what they mean, but we don't sometimes think about the direct impact if you're going through this with a direct manager or with someone who you consider to be even a colleague on your team, how much it can actually negatively impact a person in the workplace. And so I would ask you, are your career supporters culturally competent? Is there work that needs to be done there? If so, what does that look like? Because that's going to be necessary to advance this cause. 2 more to go. 4th, avoid delegating diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts to only underrepresented populations as to avoid burnout and fatigue. Now, I am sure many people on the line today would say, oh, I've heard that one before. Maybe we're going through it at our organization now. Help, Chelsea, what do? We only have a few, in this case, Black employees or a few women. And yes, we tap them for every initiative. We don't know what else to do. And I would say this is a moment where you've got to activate your allies. Again, back to that former slide. And so my question is, who is currently driving the DE&I efforts at your organization? Is it one group? Is it one individual? Is it your diversity lead or coordinator or CDO, if you have one? CDO, Chief Diversity Officer. And so you really want to think about this point because, again, this is a area of conversation that probably over the last few weeks, I've received the most phone calls from employees saying, Chelsea, I want to help advance DE&I, but I am so burned out and tired. And I feel like I'm having to take on this load, and I care about my organization, but it is so difficult and emotionally exhausting for me right now. How do I speak up about it in a way that doesn't make me seem really like against the progress of my organization? And again, I have an example. The LinkedIn message that I'll never forget. I got onto LinkedIn, it's probably now a few weeks ago, or a month ago, excuse me. And I had an interesting note in my inbox that said, "Hi, I found you. You're the only person I found on LinkedIn who I thought could help me. I have a situation at work and I need some help." And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know who this individual is. I'm asking, like, well, who connected you with me? She said, "I just found you online." And so I said, okay, let's get on a phone call, 20 minutes. What's up? How can I help you? How can I support you? This is a 2019 graduate of an institution in the New York area who is now working in consulting, a smaller boutique firm. And she reached out and said, "What do I do? The head of my business unit just told me I need to take over all of DE&I for the Americas for my company." And she says, "Chelsea, I think it's because I'm the only Black person." And she said, "What do? I care about this, but I don't know how to advance DE&I. I just graduated college. I'm trying to get up to speed myself." And it was shocking to me because, again, I know this happens, but I think all of us have to take a moment and pause and think, how are we thinking about this conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion? Are we delegating it off to the people who we think have the answers just because of how they look? Or are we truly building internal bridges where everyone has ownership and there's accountability across the board and driving outcomes? It was a powerful moment for me to certainly support her through. So we talked about how to handle it, coached her a little bit on what to say, told her she should be authentic in this moment, and there's nothing wrong with her feeling that she's not ready to take on that responsibility. And she ended up having a conversation, and they brought someone else in, but I think the intent behind that is the problem. And so we really want to think about this conversation on delegating only to particular groups. We need our allies. Who are our allies, and how can we leverage them in this moment? And our fifth point, commit to create a culture where everyone feels welcomed, valued, respected, and heard. And it sounds pretty on paper, but it actually takes a lot of effort. It's a lot of what I described in the 4 points below. In terms of checking in, staying consistent, making sure you are connecting those who might be in marginalized groups with people who are truly committed, making sure that you're thinking about the intersectional perspective as you plan programs or as you think about your policies. And so again, moment for you to reflect, how much effort goes into ensuring historically underrepresented groups feel welcomed, valued, respected, and heard? How do you know? And truly, this is a concept that everyone in a workplace, I want to be very clear, everyone should feel welcome, valued, respected, and heard. But studies show us that particular marginalized groups do not feel that. And I would tell you, over this time, doing a lot of focus groups and interviews, it's very clear that these 4 pillars, people from marginalized groups typically do not experience them. Okay, and so it takes us a moment for us to take a step back and say, how can I make sure that this is a part of the DNA of my organization? Okay, and this is important. And so as my 5th point, in my 5th case study, I would say, an organization that I'm working with has said, yeah, we really want to make sure we're creating in this moment a space for our employees to share how they're feeling, to feel valued and respected. And so they have leveraged their DE&I councils, which are basically a group of people who help to advance DE&I within an organization. Typically, they are sponsored by executive leaders back to buy-in from leadership. And they really have a seat at the table. And in this particular case, the DE&I Council has stepped up through COVID, through the racial injustices, and said, we're going to host affinity spaces for any employee who wants to come and share what's on their mind, get direct feedback. And they brought, obviously, me as a facilitator to help those conversations. But what's the point here? You do have people who are bought into advancing this work, who said in the moment of severe trauma and pain for many people. We just want to have a space where people feel that they can share their voices and their perspectives without judgment, in a safe space, and where we can move towards action. And so sometimes that's what it takes. Identifying those allies and then empowering them to step up and create these community spaces that really respond to some of the challenges that are happening on the ground. Okay, so these are just the 5 things that I think are really important as you think through developing and retaining diverse talent, particularly at the early career stage. And why? For the council conversation, early career professionals who are diverse are typically wanting community. Think about my experience leaving Spelman College, having, a parent who immigrated to the United States for college myself, and really saying community is the game changer for me. Being able to feel as though I have people who I can rely on and who can share perspective with me and introduce me to new networks and social circles, that's the game changer. And so sometimes these affinity spaces and councils can help to promote that. And so what's my big point? DE&I must be a forethought, not an afterthought, or nothing will change. And I gave you 5 examples of how we can start to consider making sure DE&I is a forethought and not an afterthought. It's so important that we do that, and we do each have a responsibility as professionals, as leaders, as family members to really say, how am I advancing DE&I? Am I a part of the solution or am I a part of the problem? Because there's no longer a middle ground. There's no longer a gray ground. We're either advancing this work and we're showing up day to day to make a difference, or we're on the sidelines. And this just becomes a checkbox activity that we do, and we come back to it again when we need to. But I know that the NACE community is committed to driving change. That's why this conversation is so critical. So I want you to take a few minutes and reflect. What is the one thing you must change or reconsider as a result of what you've learned today, or what you've been, challenged to reflect on today? Just a few minutes. Give some time for you to write it down, because it will be important to consider post-session. If you'd be willing to drop it in the chat, few sentences only or words only, no thesis statements. But if you want to share with the group, we'd love to hear what's on your mind in terms of immediate change or elements to reconsider. I see some things coming in. Liz, I see some things coming in.
Yes, Bridget says culturally competent managers. I also see I need a deeper understanding of how microaggressions look and operate. I certainly need to educate, learn, and listen more. We all do. I think it's important to know our community stakeholders before connecting with them, with our scholars, and then taking the lead on employer relations training, on D&I, and more proactive allyship.
So
just
great.
A few of the answers.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I would say, even as a facilitator who identifies as a Black woman, let me be very clear. I don't have all the answers either. Like diversity, equity, and inclusion, this work is a day-to-day, minute-to-minute commitment that's made. The conversation on bias transcends race. I even have to curve my bias. Sometimes I see it creeping up and I'm like, oh, that's not what you're supposed to do. Think in another way. So it's a challenge that is before all of us, but it's a worthy challenge that's really going to help us see sustainable change in the future. So you are in company, because there's a commitment that all of us need to make towards showing up in a more inclusive way. And so a few polls. Love polling because it shows us like the pulse check of the group. On a scale of 1 to 5, where are you right now in advancing DE&I at your organization? So 5 is right on target, 4 a little bit in the middle, like not fully there, but getting there. 3, some things in place, but there could be improvement. 2, again, somewhere in the middle. It looks like this was reversed, the poll. But 5, D&I is an afterthought. Okay, so again, go to the poll and please respond on where you are as an organization. Please refer to the poll. It looks like Maybe on the back end, the NACE team, it was put in the other way, but you get it. Go to the poll.
Apologies, everyone. The order is reversed, but the options are still the same. Getting a lot of answers so far, so I'm going to give it another 10 seconds or so for everyone else to respond. Okay. Excellent. Going to end the poll now. Thank you, everyone, for your participation.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, this is the pulse that I have been seeing across organizations. There has been quite a significant group right in the middle. Like, there's some things that we're doing. We've seen some progress, but we know there's more to do. And for many of the reasons that you described early on in the biggest challenge, those are the hindrances to you being able to really drive this forth. It looks like our second is somewhere in the middle between, maybe there's one or two things in place, but it's really an afterthought, but we'd like to do better. And to those right on target, the 4% of people, shout out to you. I want to connect with you for sure and see what's working for you. I'm sure those in the group would also. Because that's what we need. We need to be sharing best practices with each other because there's no reason to recreate the wheel. There are organizations that are really seeing sustainable change. There are individuals who are really making commitment, and those are the things that are going to empower all of us to move forward. So thank you so much for that. And then our second poll, how committed are you to building organizations where DE&I is a forethought? So again, go directly to the poll. Let us know. Are you extremely committed? I'm ready to be a part of the solution. Are you somewhere in the middle, meaning pretty committed, but also there's some things we need to work out? Are you directly in the middle, somewhat committed? Other priorities feel more important right now, and I get it. It's really a resource conversation. Or are you not committed? The first part, number one. Let us know exactly your response in the poll.
Excellent. Thank you to everyone who has answered the poll thus far. Going to give it another 15 seconds for the rest of the folks to submit their answers. All right, wonderful. Thank you everyone for your participation. I'm going to close the poll now.
That's great. Well, I didn't expect anything different from NACE. I always tell Megan and Mimi that NACE literally is my favorite association, is literally like the model of what I wish other associations really strive towards. So 62% extremely committed, 29% somewhere in the middle between really committed and other things feel like a priority. That's being authentic, because I do understand, but it is great to see that the vast majority of people want to see change and want DE&I to be an afterthought. So that is wonderful. And I was thinking a little bit about this whole future of work conversation and DE&I as a forethought. And I was thinking about my experience in early career, but then also thinking about where we are as a globe and really as a nation even. And I started thinking about what I'm hopeful that the future of work looks like. For one, I hope it's human-centered. I think COVID really showed us humanity first. Seeing people in that light is so critical in being able to build authentic bridges. I started thinking about intersectional lenses and experience being the forethought and not the afterthought as well, where marginalized groups feel like they have a seat at the table and their allies are committed to helping bring them to that table. And when they get there, giving them the voice to really speak up. I thought about active allyship in this moment, what it looks like to have not performative allyship, button showing up for the protest or the parade, but really living it day in and day out, behind closed doors, out in the front. I thought about more empathy. I think we all need that. And it's been so powerful to see that even a concept of empathy come into organizations in this moment in a way that I know I've never seen before in my lifetime. representation, and then just more authentic conversation. It is great to get to a point where people are like, oh, I can talk about race. Really? I can talk about it. It's okay. Because we need that. We need to have authentic conversation because that's how we start to build that empathy and build that understanding that helps D&I actually be a forethought. And so getting towards the end before Q&A, while the vision of a more diverse and inclusive and equitable workplace sounds great, most organizations can't get here alone, hence the poll. That's why I've committed to support the NACE community with a special offer. So as you can imagine, end of COVID into the racial injustices, a lot of folks in the DEI world have received tons of requests from people for support. But the truth is I've made the commitment that it's very important for me to do this work with organizations that want DE&I to be a forethought. And so I spoke with the NACE team about an opportunity just for the NACE community today. And so Liz is going to share the link in the chat. If you're interested, you can complete the inquiry form on the website and we'll get back to you on a rolling basis through next Thursday. And so the offer is for DE&I strategy. And it's an hour with me to be able to support where you are and where you'd like to go. It's an introduction, so it's not a full, it's not a full strategy session, but it does help you really assess what's in front of you now and what's necessary to take you to level 2.0. And it's an opportunity, again, for the NACE community to really see change happen in this moment. We cannot delegate this to 2021. We can't delegate this to 2025. We have opportunities in front of us to really see change. And it's really up to us. So again, this is an offer for NACE. The offer is for the following, and really important: organizations where DE&I is a forethought, not an afterthought; forward-thinking organizations who are committed to driving change and making real impact; organizations prepared to make the investment; and then organizations seeking a thought partner to support, advise, guide, and really just help push forth D&I best practice. And with that said, now is the time where everyone really wants to kind of get involved, and it's Q&A. So we're going to spend, it looks like we have about 40 minutes in direct Q&A where, Liz, you can share some of the questions that had come in to you or anything that you've seen in the chat, or you can come on what I like to call the main stage. Liz will unmute you and ask any questions on your mind. Thank you so much for your time.
Excellent. We do have a few excellent questions. The first comes from Natalie, and she asks, what are the best events or programs to sponsor at HBCUs that is best to engage students? Many corporations are looking into this as well, but want to make sure the engagement is impactful while also reaching a lot of students.
Wow. Yes, indeed. Juicy question. As a graduate of HBCUs, you know, I have to say, I think the first step is education. And I realize everyone won't like my answer, but I think before engaging HBCUs, I would hope that the recruitment team or the organization has spent the time to understand the history of HBCUs, the unique experiences that their students offer. And so I think before even thinking about on the ground support, which I love, and I will get to that answer, please make sure at the beginning of any initiative, there is that educational point. I remember in my Wall Street days, we went to Howard and we went to FAMU and some other institutions, and we started, you know, I said, let's do a tour. Let's all of us get acclimated with this culture and with the students who are here. Let's start with that tour, and then after we go through the tour and have these conversations, then we can actually engage because we understand the background. So I think, you know, I offered that as almost like just a little kind of disclaimer, but I think that's important before going into the actual work. I think I can talk about my experience as a Spelman student. Each HBCU is different. So that's another thing. I think a lot of times we say HBCUs, but they're different. And so we want to look at HBCUs as individual institutions as we do any other institution. So if it was Spelman College, I would say, well, Spelman's a liberal arts institution. And I was an economics major, challenging, but I was an economics major and I ended up in finance. But in full transparency, had I known there were other opportunities other than finance, I would have considered them. And so I think there's a lot that can be done with professors, with different departments just to simply explore what different career pathways look like, and then really just show how you can build a career from a liberal arts institution. I think that's still a big deal. I think the other thing with Spelman that would be very helpful is partnering with leadership groups. And I'm using Spelman as an example because I went there, but I think leadership clubs, groups, even orientation, if you can get in early with orientation from almost like a career exploration conversation, I think that's necessary and needed, because again, you don't know what you don't know. And so if you're going into college, if you're first gen, if you're low income, transparently, even if you just identify as Black, there might be some experiences that you haven't had. And so that's a great way for you to start to take those steps that are so critical to build that trust and relatability before directly going into some of the big events like homecoming. Everyone wants to do homecoming, but I think we got to start with education and really building authentic relationships with the students and staff.
Excellent. Thank you, Chelsea, and thank you, Natalie, for the good question. The next question comes from Elizabeth, and she asked, do you have any advice for those of us in industries that are traditionally white and male-dominated, where we have the additional barrier of a smaller DE&I talent pool?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Again, I think it goes back to twofold. It goes back to education. I don't know what I don't know. I don't see what I don't see. That's first. So is there a way for you to provide more exploration to this pathway? Excuse me. And then I think the second piece is allies. You have to pull on your allies. If there's not a lot of people who identify as people of color, I am confident there's others who are part of the organization who want to see difference too. And so it's bringing them into the fold, helping them to really engage these students and create a space where they feel they belong when they get there. And so my point is, yeah, it might seem hard up front, but I think when the authenticity and the true commitment, even if you don't see results in the first semester or the first year of the partnership, you still stay committed and try out different things just as you would at any other institution. I think that that's really, really important when we're talking about those organizations where there's very small representation for certain groups. You need allies. I just like the thing I'm taking to the end of the conversation. Exploration and allyship, really, really critical.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Chelsea. Next question is from Veronica. She asks, what should you do when leadership is not culturally competent, but believes they are? How can we, how can we shift or change the culture and figure out ways to help make these folks realize that they are not as culturally competent as they think?
It's like story of my life the last month. That's such a good question. No, but I honestly think it comes down to education and awareness. I think with leaders, where I saw, thinking about my finance days, where I saw great gains were in like individual conversations where I would go to the head of specific business lines who I had a good relationship and really just say, hey, here's what's working well, but here's a potential blind spot. I love the term blind spot. People are okay with that. But I think with leaders, that individual looking at them as different people, different experiences, different interest and outcome is really important. And having those conversations, and particularly if you have a few who you can really kind of build that trust with and rapport with, I tend to find if you can kind of build that influencing with those people, that can transcend to other groups. So that's really my suggestion, because there's no training or program that you could put out if you don't have that initial buy-in first. And I think that it really starts with individual relationship and individual understanding.
Fabulous. And another question regarding cultural competency comes from Stephanie. She asked, do you have suggestions on how we assess our cultural competency within a team or organization?
Yeah, no, I think again, that's a really great question. And I would go back to when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion at your organization, what does it mean to you? What outcomes are you measuring up against? If we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion broadly, let's be honest, that's so many different lenses and dimensions. But maybe you are saying that there's certain targets where you need and or desire to see immediate impact. And so you start from that lens. and you start in understanding those particular groups. And then I think once you've identified what those groups are, then it's the educational piece of saying, who is willing, and it's a lot of it is divide and conquer, and particularly if it's education and if you're limited there is that initial investment of saying, how do I understand systemic racism more? How do I understand the barrier of first generation college students, the barrier of military dependent students? And that will require each person to say, through partnership, through personal education, through even the experiences of students who we're supporting or who are coming into our organization, we need to get proximate enough to them, hence step one, to be able to use them to, and I literally mean use them in partnership, to be able to advance the goal that we've set. And so I think, again, it comes down to what's directly in front of you, what's the big vision that you have, and then how do you have each person play a role, albeit small, each step that each person's taking impacts the ultimate vision that you've set. And I think that's really important when you're talking about cultural competence. And I still am a believer in training and development. If you find the right consultant or partner, I think sometimes as an HR person, it's like, oh, we get people, but I do think it's important for us to be refreshed as well, because we can get comfortable in a mindset, or we could have blind spots that we're not seeing. And so having someone come in and refresh our understanding can be very powerful in making sure that we are really advocating for DE&I. So I think that's important.
Excellent. Thank you, Chelsea. The next question was privately submitted, and this individual asked, it often seems like pushing for inclusion and calling out biases comes at a huge cost. I have often seen those who call out biases be pushed out of organizations or sidelined. What can we do to, avoid those destructive forces when calling out biases?
Yeah, and there is such a truth to that point when it comes to really disrupting bad behavior. I think really, again, it comes down to building forms of trust. So I think there has to be, and this is an HR, actually almost something I would say to folks who are in HR capacity, we do need to have policies in place for people who are highlighting bias or microaggressions or discrimination that they're receiving. And I'm saying it, and maybe we could say, well, obviously we have that, but we'd be surprised in this moment how many organizations I hear that same point about, and people are like, well, maybe we need to have a protection for people who come and talk about biases. And so I think when we talk about DE&I program policies and practices, literally there should be a policy for someone who raises a concern, a policy of protection for them if they're coming and sharing, oh, I think that discriminatory behavior is happening on my team or with my direct report. And so if that's not in place, you're right, that's what's going to happen. The person who is sharing what they're seeing is going to be slowly asked out or moved out. And so back to policies, what policies do we have in place to make sure that we are protecting employees who are trying to actually highlight less than optimal behavior? So we're creating the culture that we're really saying and setting out to create. Really important.
Thank you. The next question comes from Betsy. And she asks, as a small office of 3 white women, are there any visual cues we can consider that would invite conversations from students who otherwise would not consider stepping inside our office?
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful. And it's something I've been reflecting on a lot now, because I think it's that toggle between, in this example, it's 3 white women. It's that toggle between we want to learn, we want to educate. So that means we need to speak with, Black students or Latinx students to understand their experience. But we have to do so in a way where we're not putting all of the emotional burden and labor on them, which is the hard balance that I think we're in the conversation that we're having in this moment. But I still think it goes back to authenticity. I still think we can't drive change if we don't know. We can't drive change if we're covering our eyes and not really seeing what's directly in front of us. So I think I still go back to the open invitation in this moment of just saying, you know what, there are some things that we want to be able to do better, but that requires us to really be able to understand, whether that's listening sessions, whether that is just focus groups or one-on-one conversations. I think that's important to do in this moment. And as I tell some of my clients, someone might decline your request in this moment because they may say, you know what, I don't actually want to have the conversation right now, because there's a lot of things that people are balancing in this moment. And if they say that, no harsh feelings. It's just where they are emotionally, and maybe it's a check-in in a month or so. But I think that we have to have conversations. So I would challenge you to reach out in an appropriate way and just say, you know, my intention is just to listen, and to better understand, you know, maybe how we have not been serving you in a way that is optimal. I never think it's too late to go back and make these types of requests, because they're forming bridges that help us advance this work.
Excellent answer, Chelsea. Thank you. The next question was privately submitted as well, and this individual asks, as a university recruiter, I'm often inviting employees to attend campus events focused on underrepresented groups. I'm reflecting on avoiding burnout and overburdening employees from those specific groups, but also sometimes feeling like it is not appropriate to invite someone that does not identify within that group or as the representative at the event, even if they are interested in being an active ally. Do you have any further thoughts on this?
Such a good question, and,
Yes.
and literally was like
Great
story of my life when I worked in finance. You need both. You truly need both, and I think that's where some people's problem is, because you have one or the other. So you have the active allies, but you don't have the historically underrepresented groups. And so people are like, okay, great, these people are nice, but is there anyone who looks like me? What am I aspiring towards? And yes, that conversation is happening with this generation for sure. Or it's, you know, we do have people of color who are coming out, but we're, as one example, right? This is one example, but we don't have, where are the people who don't look like us? Because we know the organization is not just, you know, one race or one specific population. So you need both. And for some people, that is actually the charge from the session. The charge from the session is, how do you seek to have both representation, but also active allies? Because both of them are necessary to advance this work. And so I would just challenge you to think about them both. There have been times where I remember we went to HBCUs as one example when I worked in finance, and certainly we brought people of color, because there's the commonality or the opportunity to engage. But there were students who would come to me and say, why isn't anyone else here? Like they're not dumb. They know. They're like, we know the demographics of your organizations. Why didn't other people come? And so they're definitely thinking it. So we want to get ahead of it by making sure that we are leveraging both camps where we can.
Thank you, Chelsea. Another privately submitted question for you. Do you have advice or best practices about whether or not it is appropriate for organizations to set goals for diversity in early career recruiting? And if so, how to do it appropriately? I've heard organizations say they don't feel comfortable setting goals while others have solid numbers. My gut tells me it's about how you evaluate and deliver your processes and policies. Any thoughts on that, Chelsea?
Yeah, it's a hard one. It's a really, really challenging one when we talk about goals, targets, etc. But what I'll offer on this conversation is research. I'm a research girl. So, I'll use the McKinsey Lean In study of 2019 as an example that talks about breaking the glass ceiling, and the big hucks of the report focused on, we can address the gaps of women in senior leadership by focusing on early career. Why? Because the research showed that most of the time women are behind men in that first promotion to manager. Okay, it's like a significant barrier in women getting that first promotion to manager. Now, when we talk about women of color, the number's even smaller. And so when you look at research like that, that is really showing us that our barrier starts at the early career level, first promotion several years out of college or university. That really shows me, if we are intentional about first step representation at the early career stage, and then what does it look like to advance at the early career stage, maybe we can actually see some change over the years to come. That's an opportunity where I say, research actually can help inform goals or targets that we have. But again, it comes back to culture, because I have seen some cultures actually just not be there. DE&I actually a forethought, an afterthought, not a forethought. And so targets actually create drama and are done at a time when there hasn't been buy-in first. So I think you've got to assess your company culture. But I think there's a lot of very powerful research out there that I would suggest that you read up on that talks about the importance of diversity at the early career stage and shifting representation to middle and senior management.
Excellent. Thank you, Chelsea. Next question, privately submitted as well. What would you suggest as the first step to bring the need for a focus and not just lip service regarding DE&I to the table with leadership?
What's the why? It's like the first question I've been asking some of my clients. I'm like, okay, DE, I understand why you want to connect. I understand why we're touching base at this moment, but what's the big why? Why is it important for your organization to put DE&I front and center? And so I think the first step is getting to the why. Because if there's not a why, there's not a vision. If there's not a vision, there are not goals. And so again, I think it's organization and culturally focused, but what is your why for DE&I? If it's just because everyone else is doing it, well, that's performative allyship. And we don't want performative allyship. We want sustainable systemic change. So I think if you can, and you certainly can do it, influence, coach, support your organization to really get down to the why. And I understand some organizations are numbers. So get down, if you need to, data points to be able to say, here's our why. Here's our customer, the changing, if you're a product that you're offering, what are your customers interested in, or where is our marketplace kind of moving in the future? And why is it necessary to have difference at the table? Because it's certainly necessary, but why? I think that's the big question that we've got to answer before we can move forth with vision and strategy.
Fabulous. Okay, another privately submitted question. Is there any workshop, a course, or material that you can recommend to those who would like to implement more DE&I within the workplace and amongst all student populations?
I didn't catch the last part, Liz.
Essentially, I think they're asking for recommendations for continued learning about DE&I for those that would like to implement more DE&I work within the workplace and also among student populations.
For sure. So, what can happen is if you go to, Liz, you could just put my CollegeCode, just our standard website. And in the contact us, just feel free to share in the contact form what you're looking for. And I have a list of other practitioners in our space who, if it's not me, it's someone else who I'm happy to connect you with. There's a lot of people doing really amazing work who are committed to this conversation. Some people focused on specific niches within the diversity space. I'm thinking about someone who is very close to me who focuses on she talks about workplace in general, but generations in the workplace. Another person who focuses on LGBTQ, like that is his thing because he's lived it. And certainly race and the like. So I'm happy to support.
Wonderful. And yes, I dropped that link in the chat. So please use that to submit your questions to Chelsea. I do have another privately submitted question, and it's in the form of a scenario. This individual says, in exploring DE&I affinity groups within our organization, we have found a split view from our underrepresented groups on whether or not they want to have one. A prime example would be women in the organization. Some are fearful that creating women's initiatives or groups internally will be counterproductive to their efforts to be seen as equals to men. What do you recommend in that scenario?
Again, that's it. So many of these they're so good. They're so cultural. And this is why I'm a person who is not like, do this, then it works, because so much of this conversation is culture. So much of this conversation is leadership and timing. What I will say is, again, getting to the hooks of why are DE&I councils or affinity groups important and helpful. And I will tell you, if there was ever a moment where I questioned their importance, it was all like flipped over in this moment of COVID and the racial injustices that are happening right now, because I have seen, in a way that almost brings me to tears, councils and affinity groups step up for those who have not historically spoken and created safe haven, really charged leadership to drive change in this moment. One particular organization that I'm thinking about in the media space, it was their DE&I council, their Black affinity group and their allies affinity group. Yes, they have an allies affinity group who put some suggestions together for their CEO right after everything started happening with the murders of Black men and women. And they went and spoke with their CEO. Their CEO said, yes, we want to speak with you. And they are the direct reason why there were some organizational changes that have been made that are going to impact that organization for years to come. So it's one of those things, again, you have to assess the culture and you need to get down to a why. Why is a DE&I council or affinity groups important for you? But I think the secondary piece here is understanding, if done well during moments like this, iceberg moments where we really have the opportunity to change, those councils are really the ones who are driving timely and relevant change in the moment. And I've seen it over the past few weeks. So it's powerful.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chelsea. I have a fun question from Maria.
Okay.
She asks, can you give a few examples of companies and or colleges and universities who display great DE&I programming and culture?
I could. I'm thinking about it. I'm like, I think they'll be okay if I share. One of them that I'll say is the company. Now, it's the company that I mentioned to you about the Black affinity group and the ally affinity group, and it's Hearst magazines, women's magazines, own magazines, the whole brand of Hearst, and they have just blew my mind in this moment of how they've responded and leveraged their affinity groups to respond to this current season in a way that has really promoted change in their organization. And I would say, particularly here in this space, it's so powerful, their work in DE&I, that other companies have mentioned them during sessions I've had with their companies. Like, well, Hearst does it great. We need to connect with them and see what's working for them. And so that's just one, I'll give you one. That's one that comes to my mind in this moment. And it's powerful, particularly as a media brand, how they're starting to think about representation, unique voices, intersectional lenses is really powerful. And then I think as it comes to institutions, one I'll share. This is one that I'll share. Clemson has their annual Men of Color conference. It's the only conference in the country that focuses on men of color, particularly Black and Latino men. I was a speaker at their conference early this year, right before COVID, in Greenville, South Carolina. And I will tell you, an emotionally moving moment for me, because I would often ask people, like, what are organizations doing, particularly for men of color? Like, I just would always ask. And that conference was so powerful to see both companies getting behind the advancement of the next generation of diverse men at work, but then also an institution making the investment. And the conference is just an output of a strategy that they have really engaged in all year long, working with some of the rural areas in South Carolina and providing mentorship, career development, and college access support for historically, again, marginalized and low-income men in the community. And it brought together hundreds of people. And again, a very emotional moment as you see middle schoolers saying, this has changed my trajectory, and saying, I'm passionate about STEM because of the Clemson Tiger Alliance. And for me, that was moving. So I'll share that as an example.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chelsea. Another privately submitted question. Is the National Coalition Building Institute a good resource, or is it just lip service? We've used it on campus for years, but I don't see the changes I think I should be seeing or that they should bring.
I have to be honest. A, I don't know so much about that organization. And B, I don't have an opinion on it. So I'm not sure about that one, to be honest. But what I would say is I'm a big proponent of if you're not seeing what you are hoping to see, have the conversation. You know, bring them together and say, here's what I'm feeling. I could be wrong. Here's what I'm expecting. And it's not necessarily what I'm seeing, because I think sometimes we're quick to cancel or dismiss individuals or organizations. And we do it before we've actually had a conversation with them. So I would just encourage you to have that conversation with them first, and use that as your kind of decision-making marker to decide how you'd like to move forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Chelsea. I have another question. It's in regards to one of your earlier slides, these slides for step number 3. Rachel has a particular question about that slide. Will we be able to go back to that slide?
Yeah, sure. What's the question?
She wants to know if you can share ideas on how she, as a career services representative, can be sure that her recruiters are following the advice that you shared in step 3.
Yeah, I think it's cultural competence. Let's see. 5, 4, 3. No, it's this one. So yeah, it's cultural competence. This is supposed to be 3. So yeah, the cultural competence conversation, again, I think comes down to once you've outlined your diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of vision and strategy, I think that you really can have a moment to take a step back and say, what is it that we need to do? So if we're talking about, a lot of people use the term people of color. I've used the term people of color, but I think we have to be cautious with using the term people of color, because I think it allows us to bucket transparently anyone non-white. And I think that's dangerous, because I think we need to look at that group differently as different subsets within a broader conversation. So I think once you've kind of decided as one lens what you'd like to focus on, I think that the conversation becomes, here's what we don't know, and whether that's bringing in an external facilitator to help you get up to speed. There's so many resources and tools that are out in the market now for free for people to be able to leverage just to gain that general understanding. I think that's just a really important first step, because again, people don't know what they don't know. And if someone says, I don't know, we could have a million thoughts in our mind about, is that true? Is it not true? But our responsibility is to educate them and help them to get up to speed in their level of awareness. So again, as the manager, you're making sure that everyone is on a level playing field of awareness. And again, I have so many people come to me and say, Chelsea, training and development doesn't work. And here's my thought. Some people need to be trained. Some people need to be trained. Senior leader or coordinator, we have to get back to the point where we're learning. Like, training and development is about learning and education and awareness. And so we can take that step back to make sure that we're creating that environment for our teams. I think that's a powerful way to move forward.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chelsea. Those are all of the questions I've received thus far. So if anyone would like to step up to the virtual floor and ask a question directly, I'm happy to. Please use the raise your hand function and I will happily unmute your line. But in the meantime, I just want to share a lot of feedback that we're getting through the chat. Michelle specifically said that she wants to express how dynamic, informative, and motivating this presentation has been. Thank you so much. And I've seen a lot of people thanking you for this presentation, Chelsea.
I'm so glad. It's, in speaking with the NACE team, I know that it's top of mind for so many people. And I will say, you know, the presentation doesn't have all the answers, but I do think that there are things that we can take a moment to step back and reflect on. And I say, even if it's one big action that we take after this session that we're going to go back and kind of work and meddle over, that's powerful, because the answers start with us. And I think that's the biggest point in this DE&I moment that's happening across the globe. We as individuals have an opportunity and a responsibility to push things forth. And we can do that when we take a moment to reflect and say, what's working, what's not working, and what do I need to take it to the next level? So thank you for that point.
Excellent. Okay, wonderful. Well, it looks like those are all the questions that we have from our group.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Awesome.
So we will hand back to the NACE team to close us out.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Chelsea and Elizabeth, for a really informative session. And thank you to our sponsor, Tallo, for sponsoring today's event. And to all of our attendees, we appreciate you being here. This officially concludes today's webinar. You may now sign off. Have a wonderful day.